Of course, there was a lavish reception to follow. The story goes that the groom got cold feet, kind of like that 1999 movie, The Runaway Bride. But this time it was the groom who took off for the hills. The wedding was canceled, of course, but there was still the matter of the reception. And all the food was purchased and paid for, and it was all laid out on the table ready to go. So the Atlanta newspaper reported that buses were sent to the Salvation Army and to many of the downtown shelters.
And all of us here?
The buses soon returned to the country club, the seats filled with the poor, the hungry, the homeless, the street people. There they sat down to a banquet the likes of which they had never dreamed of, let alone experienced. Fresh crab, lobster, steamed baby carrots, a far cry from the soup kitchen meals they were used to. Those of us who do not go to bed hungry night after night, or don't count on a soup kitchen for a hot meal, can't possibly imagine what that must have been like for those outcast and marginalized people of Atlanta. Only those in such desperate need can comprehend the sheer joy and wonder of sitting down to such a magnificent feast, unexpected and undeserved. That is what the parable from our gospel reading is all about. And my friends, we are those people in such desperate need. We have been invited to a banquet. In the parable, the wedding banquet represents God's gift of salvation. This gift is totally free, and we are totally undeserving. The expected response is one of sheer joy, rejoicing in the extravagant meal set before us. But in this parable, there is an unexpected twist. We could say that there are actually three radical twists in this story. First, there is radical inclusiveness. The king invites the usual guests to the banquet, but by the end, absolutely everyone is included on the guest list, the good and the bad. Second, there is radical, even incomprehensible anger and violence on the part of the king. The king interrupts the whole wedding day to send his troops off to destroy the guests who refuse to come to the banquet, and even burned their city, presumably a city in his own kingdom. And on top of that, one of the guests invited off the street at the last moment is thrown into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth because he wore the wrong clothes. Seems a bit harsh, doesn't it? And then third, there is a radical, I think I'll wait a little later for that. Let's go back to that angry king. If we look a little closer, we find that this is actually a patient king. As the parable begins, there are many who have already been invited to the wedding banquet. They had received a sort of save-the-date notice a while back. Now everything is ready, the food is prepared, and the messengers are sent out to gather those who had been invited. But for some strange reason, they decide to stay away. You know what that's like, right? We sometimes hear of something that's going to come up in a week or two and think, that sounds like fun, I think I'll go. But then other things come up as time goes on, and as we come to the day of the whatever the event is, we decide we're just not going to go. Well, here is where we see the patience of the king. One would think that he would immediately fly into a rage. All the food is ready, the king's son and his bride are anticipating a wonderful wedding celebration, and then nobody shows up. But this king is a patient king. He sends out more messengers to those same folk, urging them to change their minds and join the celebration. And what happens? Some of the invited guests make light of it. They're just apathetic. They disregard the invitation. Other invited guests turn to violence. They mistreat and kill the messengers. Now, finally, the king's patience runs out. Anger erupts, but there is justification for this anger. The anger is directed at the ones who have hurt those closest to the king, those that he loves. His son has been hurt that no one showed up to celebrate the wedding. and his servants have been mistreated and killed. Well, like I said in the children's sermon, who is the king? It is God. We have a patient and a loving God. But as we hear frequently in the Bible, God does have an angry side. What causes God's anger? Well, one commentator had a great answer to that question. What this parable points out, and what is consistent with God's anger throughout the whole Bible, is that God's anger comes because people whom God loves are mistreated, and they suffer and are killed. God's anger is not the opposite of God's love, but rather God's anger comes because God loves. Behind the anger, there's probably also disappointment. God's love and grace are available to all God's people. All have been offered the invitation to an extravagant banquet. All have been offered God's salvation. And it's God's desire that all will be saved. Some have rejected God's grace. And God is angry because some of those whom God loves will be lost. Back to the parable. When a king plans a party, there will be a party. More messengers are sent out, this time to invite absolutely anyone they can find out in the streets, in the homeless shelters, living in cardboard boxes, the poor, the hungry, the lost. And all these surprised and undeserving guests throng into the banquet hall, sharing in a bountiful feast, celebrating together with the king and his son. The music swells, the credits roll, and it's a happy ending to what appears to be a tragic story. But wait, there is more. In the midst of this crowd, the king spots one young man who is not wearing the correct attire. His clothes are all wrong for a banquet. Once again, the king's anger is kindled against this poor guy who was just grabbed off the street, and he has the wrong clothes on. He has no wedding robe, and he is thrown out into the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The point of the parable is not, of course, about clothes. There is a symbolic meaning, and it has to do with that third radical twist to this parable. This is a radical call for discipleship. It is a call, in the Apostle Paul's word, to clothe yourself with a new self, to clothe yourself with Christ. God invites us to come as we are, but God loves us too much to leave us as we are. For the young man without a robe, it was not enough to just show up for the banquet. The expectation was that he would participate fully in the celebration, be fully engaged in joining in the joy of the occasion. Matthew recorded this parable for those within the community of faith, for those insiders like you and me. And so this final part of the parable is a radical call to discipleship for us. A call to live out our faith, not just to show up for the banquet, but to put our faith into action, not just on Sunday morning, but Monday through Saturday as well. God's love, mercy, and grace are freely given, but that grace is transforming. The story of the proper attire for the banquet tells us that how we live matters. Our response to God's grace matters. We are not yet at the wedding banquet. The final feast is yet to come. But each week we come here for a wedding rehearsal of sorts. We come here for a foretaste of the feast to come. We come to be reminded of God's grace, to be fed and nourished through the Word and the sacraments. We come to be strengthened for a life of radical discipleship, to be reminded of God's all-inclusive, radical love. We come to be reminded that God's transforming grace requires nothing less than our whole life. We must ask ourselves how that will play out in our lives this week. In the aftermath of the worst mass shooting in modern U.S. history, how do we respond as people of God? When faced with the devastating disaster in Puerto Rico, what are we being called to do? As we view the loss of life and destruction of property from the California fires on the news, how are we, those living under God's transforming grace, called to respond? When we hear of the increase in hate crimes, like those in Fargo-Moorhead recently, what are we to do? And in our daily lives, at work, at school, at play, in our labor, and in our leisure, how are we answering that radical call to discipleship? These are the questions raised by this parable in our time. This is a time when these questions must be answered by all of those invited into God's banquet, all those who are offered God's gift of salvation, all those who have experienced God's transforming grace. Amen.